Here at McGill University at the CETA conference with Professor Andreas Ziegler. He's a professor in international law at the University of Lausanne in Switzerland. Thank you very much for being with us today, Mr. Ziegler.
Thank you very much.
So, how does the European Union stand to benefit from the CETA?
So the European Union is probably one of the most important players when it comes to bilateral agreements, not only in recent years, but basically already since the 60s and 70s. And of the many agreements the European Union has concluded in recent years, Canada is certainly a very attractive candidate because, of course, it's a rich economy, a sophisticated economy, and so many of the European products could very much see their chances of being sold here increased by this agreement.
Is the CETA looked at as a priority for the European Union?
Yes, I think so, for two reasons. As I said, Canada, among the OECD countries, is certainly close to the European Union. It is a relatively rich market, and of course, if one sees it in parallel to the negotiations with the United States, it is also seen as a preparation for those negotiations. And then once both agreements should be in place, it would mean for European companies that the entire North American market is now open to them.
What are some specific provisions and areas in the agreement that the European Union was most actively looking to benefit from?
Often in these agreements, traditionally, of course, the main issue were tariffs. And even here in this agreement, in some areas, remain some tariffs. So if you talk to the industries in those fields, they would clearly say that that makes a huge difference to them, because a 20% tariff, as we sometimes see on very isolated items, for a company that can be exactly the profit margin that makes that whether they can enter a market or not. Now, on the whole, from a governance perspective, the European Union in recent years has put a lot of emphasis on services, just as Canada. They're both very developed economies, and so they're services and technologies economies. And the same is also true for the European Union, which has services providers, be it in financial services, in telecom, that are extremely active and competitive. And they look, of course, at the Canadian consumers and know that these consumers would appreciate these services. The same is true then for certain for specific products. For the European Union, for example, in agriculture, European wine, European cheese, while this is no longer of such an importance for the economy as a whole, for specific countries, member states and regions, it is extremely important. There, it is on one side market access, but then of course also intellectual property rights, the geographical indications. There the European Union in recent years has always sought relatively ambitious results in these negotiations. A third, maybe just to mention another important area, is public procurement, because many countries have not made major commitments, and so these bilateral agreements are basically the door opener to do that.
I know you've been looking at this issue of government procurement. Does the CETA go much farther than previous agreements that the EU has made in this regard? In which contracts are EU companies looking to benefit on? Is it these construction contracts, municipal contracts, utilities, hospitals, education? What are they really looking to gain from this?
So both the Canada and European Union, if you compare them to other countries around the globe, are of course already very advanced in this field. They're both parties to the government procurement agreement under the WTO, which only very few basically developed countries, OECD countries, are members of. So there, in a way, of course, they have already a much higher level of liberalization than other countries would have. Yet, in the WTO, these negotiations were concluded basically 20 years ago, and not much has been done since then. And here, while the European Union, for domestic reasons, is relatively open, Canada has made commitments only at the state level, and here now the opening and commitments undertaken by the provinces, that will make a major difference for the European Union, and that's why this was very important to them.
Were there specific areas of contracts that you think they'll be taking advantage of or looking to get into the procurement markets?
Yeah. I mean, the European Union is very big. No, there are 28 member states and a lot of people, not only as consumers but also as workers. So I would say the European Union today has probably companies in all areas of public procurement. Nevertheless, of course, there may be certain that are particularly developed. So you mentioned, construction or public utilities, where we have several member states where we have a long tradition for that. For example, in France, you have a few public utilities company that are really very active globally, and they are certainly also looking at the Canadian market and interested in being more active here.
Finally, I just wanted to ask you, there's been some reports of sentiment against the CETA from certain politicians in Germany, some members of European Parliament, and how do you see this unfolding, the process of ratification in the European Union member states?
Yeah, this has certainly become much more difficult in recent years. It is true, with globalization, we all see how quickly things are changing, and not only the multilateral negotiations, but also these bilateral agreements, especially if they are ambitious as CETA is, does contribute to that. So you have all the discussions we have already seen continue, and they're also very justified because some of these changes, society has to cope with them. And so it is important for politicians to look at what is happening. Is it happening anyhow, or is it only happening because of these agreements? And how can these agreements then contribute to maybe find solutions? Because the liberalization usually leads to some type of structural adjustment. Now, this is, of course, a word that has positive and negative sides. It means that certain industries or parts of the economy that are maybe not so competitive will be get smaller. And that means, of course, an adjustment where some people may lose their job, or the increased competition may put pressure on them. There may also be certain structural things one has, the special rights, for example, of the provinces, that you have to look at then from a domestic perspective also. What will happen? Are there maybe measures one can take to make this more acceptable, to counterbalance certain things? All states these days have to cope with that.
Professor Ziegler, I want to thank you for your time today and enjoy the conference.
It was my pleasure. Thank you very much.